Hello, dear colleagues. Northern Priazovia is one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse regions of modern Ukraine. Starting in the last third of the 18th century, these lands became home to tens of thousands of colonists from all over the Russian Empire: Greeks, Germans, Armenians, Poles, and of course Jews. The colonization policy of the Russian Empire was violent, but as a result of this artificial resettlement, a unique conglomeration of cultures was formed in the northern Priazovia region, in which each managed to preserve its identity despite centuries of assimilation policies of Russia and then the Soviet Union. The problem of the historical and socio-cultural development of Mariupol Jewry in terms of the scientific elaboration, one on the hand enjoys the constant attention of Ukrainian researchers, and one on the other hand, they face a number of obstacles, primarily of a methodological and source study nature. In Ukraine, the stage of scientific comprehensions of the significance of Jewish communities in the history of the regions of the Southeast came too late. Approach to covering the topic were formed mainly by local historians, whose merit was concentrating the available source base on the history of Mariupol Jewry, but gaps in scientific methodology led to a certain schematism and template in the presentation of the material. The outbreak of Russian hybrid aggression against Ukraine in 2014 left its mark on interest in Azov Jewry, which is growing significantly, but at the same time, the source base for research on regional aspects of Jewish issues is undersweet. In 2022, the situation became catastrophic with the destruction of a significant array of documents in the Donetsk archives and the Mariupol Museum of Local Law. It became virtually impossible to fully study the history of Mariupol Jewish community. All present, we believe that the main vector for the development of the problem is the study of contemporary process in the Jewish community, which was dispersed as a result of full-scale Russian aggression and the parallel collection of oral testimonies of Jewish migrants who were forced to leave their homes due to the horrors of war. Nevertheless, we consider it necessary to outline the main problematic issues of the historical development of the Jewish communities of the Azov Sea region, which are reflected in the scientific work of Ukrainian historians, traditionally concentrated around thematic blocks of the pre-Soviet period, articles by Andrei Alferov, Anna Hedyo, and numerous works by Ilya Lukovenko. The Holocaust, publication by Volodymyr Romantsov, and the socio-cultural life of Mariupol Jewry, studies by the aforementioned Ilya Lukovenko, Olena Suchkova, and Alexander Cheremissyn. There is no systematic interest in English language historiography in the problem of the tragedy of Mariupol Jewry during the period of Russian aggression in 2014-2022. Rather, we are talking about the presence of individual stories in more general studies by Western researchers that are somehow related to the topic. The pioneering work of Jacob Lviv, who in the early 17th lifted the veil of secrecy for the Western world about the situation of Ukrainian Jewish communities in the pre-war decade, is still relevant today. An illustration of the general view of the problem of ethnic minorities in Ukraine after 2040 is an article by British political scientist Hussein Aliyev, who focuses in particular on the participation of representatives of Ukrainian Jewry in the elements of the Revolution of Dignity and the Russian-Ukrainian War, based on publications in the Ukrainian media. The English language works of scholars from post-Soviet countries published in international peer-reviewed journals can serve as a certain marker of the interest of the academic community in the topic. In this context, it is worth highlighting Andrei Kravchuk's text on the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war on certain ethnic minorities in Ukraine, of Viktor Yelensky's studies on the religiosity of Ukrainian Jewry at the turn of the 20th and 21st century. Oral history remains perhaps the only promising area of research into the socio-cultural process in the Jewish community of the south and southeast of Ukraine, given the disastrous state of the original source materials on the history of Jewish communities in the south of Ukraine. Here we can note an important article by Anna Vilegala about family history and the parallels with the Second World War and the Holocaust in particular, that refugees from the occupied territories draw in their oral histories. The Jewish narratives in Vilegala's article are presented only as an illustrative case, but they allow us to draw attention to the similarities in the Jewish oral tradition of the trials of Jewish regardless of time and space. Our study aims to draw the attention of the European and international community to the urgent problems of the Jewish population of the Northern Prazovia region, some of whom were forced to leave their homes as a result of the full-scale invasion of the region by Russian troops, and some of whom found themselves under occupation under the threat of complete assimilation and loss of their own ethnocultural identity. Jews have been a characteristic feature of the ethnocultural phase of the Mariupol since its foundation, because in accordance with the privileges of the Russian Empire granted to Greek immigrants, representatives of other ethnic groups were not allowed to settle in the city. This ban was lifted only in 1859, and from that point onwards we have more or less accurate transformation about the number of Jews in Mariupol. During the second half of the 19th and early 20th centuries, it gradually increased from 5 to 15 of the total population. It should be noted that in the pre-Soviet period, almost all Jews in Mariupol were religious and identified themselves as practicing Judaism. The situation changed only during the revolution and subsequent political repressions, when being Jewish became a marker of a threat to life. Traditionally, the Jewish community of the city was united around a religious and cultural center, a synagogue, which they did not have at the time of the legislation of the Jewish community of Mariupol in 1859. Until the mid-19th century, due to their semi-legal status, Jews were forced to rent premises for their religious needs. But in 1859, the first house of worship was opened, and in 1882, the second. We don't record any state or municipal involvement in this process. The opening and support of prayer house was initiated by wealthy community members, merchants, and manufacturers. At the beginning of the 20th century, communities of representatives of the Hasidic movement were recorded in Mariupol, which also had their own house of worship, but one cannot speak of a large number and the influence of the Hasidic community. Urban Jews generally remained committed to traditional Judaism. Also, the community was not monolithic and was formed both from immigrations from other cities of southern Ukraine, for example, Berdiansk and Melitopol, and from Jews from Podila and even the Baltic states. The Jewish community of Mariupol has its own regional specifically, which is due to the historical conditions of the formation of the Jewish community in the south and the southeast of Ukraine. From the very beginning, the Jewish community in this area coexisted with other minority cultures, which contributed to the formation of a tolerant attitude towards Jews and prevent them from forming isolated communities, as was the case in most areas of compact Jewish settlement in Ukraine. At the stage of the formation of the ethnocultural palette of modern southeastern Ukraine, the quality of oppression of the Jewish population could only be described as high by the Russian imperial government, which clearly limited the area of Jewish settlement, increased tax and military duties for representatives of this ethnic community, and until 1870 blocked their participation in local government. However, we do not observe any manifestations of anti-Semitism, except for the so-called domestic, on the part of representatives of the ethnic community, even Ukrainians and Russians. After the above-mentioned restrictions of Jewish participation in local government were lifted, Jews in Mariupol were less willing to take advantage of this opportunity than in other cities of the south. An example is Katerinoslav, modern Dnipro, where Jews accounted for 13 of the municipal authorities. This was followed by Karasubazar, now Bilohirsk, with 10.5% of Jews, Odessa 6.4%, and Pavlograd 6.3%. Mariupol wasn't on this list at all during the Russian Empire. Apart from a high percentage of Greeks, 40.3%, other ethnic groups were not represented of the Mariupol self-government. Jews were much more interested in issue of self-determination than in influencing the overall process of regional governance. The Jews of southern Ukraine were characterized by a high level of assimilation, which was due to the need to quickly integrate into the socio-economic landscape of the region in the order to survive. Jewish immigrants from the isolated religious communities of Volyn and Spodilla quickly forgot the cultural practices of their ancestors, which contributed to the formation in the south, including Mariupol, of their own cultural type of Ukrainian Jewry, which was closer to traditionalism than the Jewry of right-bank Ukraine, characterized by an extremely high prevalence of various themes of religious mysticism. That is why the Jews in Mariupol didn't actually stand out from the urban population in terms of cultural and religious practices. To a large extent, this was characteristic of all ethnic communities on the northern coast of the Sea of Azov. Thus, the Jewish community of Mariupol was very vulnerable to assimilation process, which became evident in the period of independent Ukraine. The Ukrainian Revolution was a period of awakening for the Jews of Mariupol, as well as for the Jews of southern Ukraine in general. This awakening wasn't only cultural and economic, but also political. This process was facilitated by the long-lasting restrictions on the right and freedoms of the Jewish population that had been in place in the Russian Empire and were abolished with the fall of the Tsar, and well as by the high level of education of the Jewish population. Key interest of young people in creating all conditions for the development of Jewish culture within in Ukrainian state, which was within the trust of Jews with tolerant legislation and promises of equal rights. Thus, as early as 1970s, the Jewish community was in full solidarity with Ukrainian authorities, supporting the course of self-determination for the peoples and territories of the former Russian Empire. At the same time, Mariupol became one of the centers of the Zionist movement, where were about 300 representatives of the so-called young Zionist organizations in the city, who advocated the idea of quarantine Jewish territories in the Middle East to create their own state. The era of the Ukrainian Revolution was the period of the first rise in national and cultural life and the history of Mariupol Jewry, which was made possible by the liberal policy of the Central Rada towards all ethnic communities living in the newly created state. At the same time, this brief period preceded the 17 years of fear and terror in which the Jews in Mariupol would live in the post-Soviet Ukraine during the Nazi occupation of the city. Turning to the problem of the historical memory of Mariupol Jewry, we can speak of the complete erasure of the pre-Soviet period, as a case which should be sought in the tragedy of the Holocaust during World War II and the ability of the human psyche to preserve in the memory only the most significant and pivotal moment. That is why the almost complete destruction of the Jewish community of Mariupol became the most striking moment in its history, completely leveling and developing the rich heritage of pre-Soviet Mariupol Jewry, the memory of which began to be revived only in now. The first destruction of the Mariupol Jewish community, which took place in 1941-1943, was indeed unprecedented in its scale and consequences. In fact, after the final solution to the Jewish questions in Mariupol, the community never recovered. According to official estimates, alone about 9,000 people died. By eyewitnesses, the local historians and local historians in Mariupol insist on a figure of 40,000 people in 1941 alone. For the Soviet authorities, the tragedy of the Holocaust in Mariupol did not exist. Even after the war, when local residents, family members of the dead Jews tried to erect memorials at the places where their relatives were shot, they were denied for a long time, and even when these obelisks were erected, the word Jews was not on them. The intensification of the cultural life in the Jewish community in Mariupol coincides with the early 2000s. At that time, there were already a significant number of Jewish organizations in the city, but all of them were humanitarian in nature, taking care of the elderly, the sick, etc. As for the educational and religious life of Jewish youth, this direction didn't even exist in the beginning. Moreover, despite the fact that the population census had been conducted the previous year, the leadership of the Jewish community in Mariupol had no information about the number of Jewish youth who could be involved in cultural initiatives. The community activities were formed through a regular survey and persuasion of Mariupol Jews who did not want to unite in any legal organization, as the memory of the Jewish pogroms and the Holocaust was too fresh and strong. At least these were the reasons for refusing to participate in the cultural life of the community, given the interviews of the first chief rabbi Menachem Mendel Cohen. However, already in the first months of his ministry, Rabbi Cohen formed the core of activists of the Jewish community of Mariupol, which numbered 28 people who then worked in the chosen areas, namely the organization of religious life, a Jewish school, and the kindergarten. These were the priority tasks for the activists, given the high rate of community gain and the general positivity of the city's Jewish community, which could not be compared to the vibrant life of the Greek community in the Mariupol. The system of educational institutions for Jews created by Mendel Cohen covered all age groups. The Jewish kindergarten was closely linked to the Smart G school, with which Jewish children continued to attend regular Mariupol schools. Older children and young people could continue their education with religious focus at the Smart School and at the Kollel Torah courses for older Jews, which were equally accessible by both men and women. In addition to the synagogues, of which there were 3 in the town, Jews had their own ritual bath, mikvah, and their own cemetery. The traditional isolation of the Jewish community and its complete self-sufficiency, the possibility of development and implementation of all spheres of their traditional way of life were preserved. As a multicultural city, Mariupol was an ideal place for the development of a Jewish cultural center, as historically tolerance towards national minorities has long been considered one of Mariupol's hallmarks. Since its revival in the first half of the 2000s, the Jewish community has not been isolated and has maintained strong ties with other national communities in the city, primarily with Mennonite Germans, given the long history of coexistence between Jewish and Mennonite communities in both southern and western Ukraine. In developing the cultural activities of the Jewish community, Mendel Cohen follows the path borrowed from representatives of other national organizations in Mariupol, emphasizing the traditional ritual rather than religious component of cultural activists, as Mariupol Jews were faithful to tradition but completely non-religious. It should be noted that this is how most Jewish communities in Ukraine can be characterized. Nevertheless, one cannot say that there was no religious life in Orthodox Jews in Mariupol. The community had about 300 so-called Halakhic Jews with an established Jewish mother, who made up the set of the religious part of the community. There is evidence that until 2022, more than 100 people gathered in the main Mariupol synagogue on major Jewish holidays. Several dozen were always present at traditional Shabbat prayers, and even in a daily prayer, it was possible to gather a minyan of 10 adult men. It should be noted that in Mariupol, in the period 2014-2022, where there were 3 full-fledged synagogues in the form of prayer house. These were so-called historical synagogues, which, however, were not used for the religious purpose for various reasons. One built-in war converted into a space for artistic events. Also in 2021, it hosted thematic events related to Holocaust remembrance. The second house of worship was transferred to the ownership of a Protestant religious organization. The third building was not on the list of cultural or religious spaces in Mariupol at all. The main synagogue and community premises were located in a small building next to the city, next to the site of the Mariupol Choral Synagogue, which has not been preserved in its original form. However, in 2020, the synagogue and the community moved to another location, the former puppet theater. The reason for this was an attack on a synagogue security guard while Rabbi Cohen was also in the building. It is hardly appropriate to talk about an outbreak of anti-Semitism in multicultural Mariupol, and the attack can be attributed to mental disorders in the behavior of an individual. The deployment of the hybrid aggression of the Russian Federation in eastern Ukraine has not dramatically affected the activities of the Jewish community of Mariupol. The Jewish community was informed about this in September 2014 by the city's chief Rabbi Mendel Cohen. The leadership of the Jewish community of Mariupol did not leave the frontline city. Also, they took care of the safety of the community. Some of the Jews of Mariupol moved into Dnipropetrovsk and Zhytomyr, where the relevant regional centers of Ukrainian Jewry organized decent living conditions for kosher meals a day and education for children and youths. At the same time, the Jewish community of Mariupol also focused on helping refugees from areas where active hostilities were taking place. Mendel Cohen noted that in some places, Jews from certain settlements of the Donetsk region left with only one suitcase. It should also be emphasized that Jewish activists in Mariupol showed greater loyalty to the current Ukrainian government than the vast majority of the city's business community. Banks, restaurants, and the markets were closed in Mariupol, but the Jewish community did not even change their usual working hours, which helped protect the Mariupol Jewish community from the consequences of panic. One of the roadblocks of the pro-Russian separatists who seized control of the city government in 2014 was located close to the Mariupol synagogue, but this didn't prevent the Jewish community from gathering every Saturday and offering traditional Shabbat prayers. Rabbi Cohen recalled in one of his later interviews that the separatists didn't touch the Jews, but the fear was very great, especially given the fact that the Shabbat Jews moved around the city exclusively in foot, remaining faithful to tradition. Cohen's statement about the situation in the city had a wide international resonance as they were voiced and quoted not only in Ukrainian and Russian, but also in English and Hebrew, which helped inform the international community about the situation in eastern Ukraine since the beginning of Russian aggression. Rabbi Cohen's thesis about the premonitions of war, what permitted the air of Mariupol, is significant in the context of Jewish oral tradition. It is a kind of narrative code that portends bad times for the Jewish community. Thus, Cohen also emphasized the apolitical nature of the Jewish community, which should only care about preserving its own identity and the population and not be an advocate for the state authorities or certain political groups. Once again, Ukrainian Jewry should, in solidarity with the Ukrainian nation, with the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian troops on 24 February 2022. The Jews in Mariupol took part in the defense of Mariupol and even survived capture. One of the Jewish defenders of Mariupol, Vitaly Barabash, even appealed to the Israeli government during the siege of the city to help Ukrainians who had never left Jews in trouble, and now Jews should do the same. The issue of national identity clearly lays into the background for Ukrainian Jews, as in the eyes of the aggressor. They were all Ukrainians. It was in 2022 that the Jewish community of Ukraine faced a threat of another erasure that had all the prerequisites to become final. What is the basis for such a pessimistic forecast? Russian troops don't implement the policy of targeted ethnic cleaning that took place during World War II, but targeted deportation with subsequent assimilation is still a reliable tool of Russia's denationalization policy. Jewish religious buildings, the so-called Old Synagogue, and the community center in Mariupol were completely destroyed by the hostilities, as there were 10 other synagogues across Ukraine and cannot be restored. Only their re-erection is possible after the deoccupation of the city. The Jewish community of the city itself was effectively destroyed. Some were deported to Russia and some ended up on the territory controlled by Ukraine, from where they were repatriated to Israel. The latter process is of great importance for ensuring the existence of Jewish communities in Ukraine, which is one of the largest centers of Jewishness in Europe. The fact is that the easing of the procedure for issuing Israeli passport to repatriates from Ukraine with the outbreak of full-scale war led to a massive outflow of the Jewish population. This was especially true of the territories of eastern and southern Ukraine that were most threatened by the scale of hostilities. In the spring of 2022, about 50% of all Jews left Ukraine for Israel under the repatriation program. At first glance, this is not such a large figure in the scale of the total number of Ukrainian refugees, but the problem is that Jews will not return to the territories of compact residence even in the event of their deoccupation. The Israeli government has created conditions for new citizens that facilitate their full integration into new communities in Israel. Ukraine, in turn, is also doing everything in its power to stop the erasure of the Jewish community. In particular, the Karaites and Krimchaks, unique ethnic groups of Eastern European Jewry that developed under the dominance of Islam and managed to preserve their religious identity, have been granted special protection. These two ethnic groups were able to obtain the status of indigenous peoples in Ukraine. Also, their communities in Mariupol and Melitopol were completely destroyed, and there are not prospects for their recovery today. As an illustrative example of the uncertain future of the Karaites of Ukraine, it is worth paying attention to the cultural losses suffered by this ethnic group as a result of the Russian invasions. From the religious point of view, Ukrainian Karaites are a separate branch of Jews, as they do not recognize the Talmud as equal the importance to the Torah. The only Karaite synagogue on the territory of Ukraine was located in Kharkiv and is currently being heavily damaged by Russian shelling, forcing it to close. The leader of the Kharkiv community fled the city. A separate Karaite culture center existed in Mariupol, but ceased to operate after the city was occupied. The Karaite community in Mariupol is considered to have been completely destroyed, not physically, but territorially, as a significant number of Mariupol Karaites were deported to Russia. Thus, in the south and east of Ukraine, large Karaite communities have ceased to exist, and the guarantees of their protection as indigenous peoples are a belated, more symbolic act. The Jewish community of Mariupol needs a full-scale invasion in much the same way as the beginning of the Gibrit aggression in 2014. Relatively united and without panic. A resident of the city, Victoria Levashina, who belonged to the Jewish community, recalled that her sick mother continued to be visited by employees of the Jewish charity Hesed, despite the fact that from the very first days, Mariupol was under heavy shelling. However, it was possible to maintain a more or less normal functioning of Jewish organization only until the end of February 2022, when the city was completely deprived of electricity, heating, and communication. The symbol of connection with the community for Mariupol Jews was the city synagogue, and during the hottest battles for Mariupol, representatives of the Jewish community tried to seek salvation in the synagogue. This is how Sergei Boltinsky died when he tried to break through the synagogue at the end of March 2022 and was fatally wounded by the debris. Even then, the Jews of Mariupol did not lose hope for an organized evacuation, which the synagogue had promised to provide information about at the beginning of the hostilities. After the end of the fighting in the city, part of the community had the opportunity to evacuate, either to the territory controlled by Ukraine or to the territory of the so-called Donetsk People Republic. But first they had to undergo a procedure known as filtration. The essence of the procedure was to fully check a person for involvement in the Ukrainian army or assistance to the Ukrainian military. It was and also show disloyalty to the Russian occupiers in the form of a careless post on social media to fail the filtering procedure and be arrested or physically destroyed. Jews in Mariupol who had relatives in Russia planned to go to them in order to emigrate to Israel. At least such plans were mentioned by Victoria Levashina in her memoirs, but they failed to pass the filtration measures. Living for the territory of the Russian Federation was out of the questions. The chief rabbi of Mariupol, Menachem Mendel Cohen, wasn't in the city at the time of the Russian invasion, but was organizing the evacuation of community members from Mariupol. While in Israel we managed to organize a convoy of evacuation buses from Mariupol to Zaporizhia, but the intensity of the hostilities prevented the evacuation from taking place. It should be noted that during the evacuation process, community activists led by Rabbi Cohen also resorted to informal means involving private commercial inquiries and carried out targeted evacuations of Jews from suburban villages. In addition To these channels various humanitarian missions, such as Christians of Israel, which evacuated people directly to Israel, also joined the evacuation. This was a clear logistic of such trips. Community members who wished to stay in Ukraine were taken along the Mariupol-Berdyansk-Zaporizhia road. For repatriation, people were taken to Vinica and then to Chisinau, Moldova. It should be noted that one identified part of the Jewish community remained of Mariupol occupied by Russian troops, and even under such conditions targeted humanitarian aid from Jewish organizations continues to arrive in the city through informal means. Of course, it is currently impossible to talk about any religious life of the Jewish community in Mariupol because the community itself does not exist. Its leader is in Israel, and all religious buildings have been destroyed. There are no sacred Torah scrolls in the city, as they were all evacuated before the full occupation of Mariupol. Some cultural monuments of the Jews of Mariupol were taken by the Russian occupation forces. For example, a handwritten Torah scroll from the collection of the Mariupol Museum of Local Law. In the modern Jewish tradition, the tragedy of Mariupol community is often identified with the Holocaust. These comparisons can also often be found in the Israeli media. In particular, Edward Sirota drew such parallels from describing the story of Elvira Bortz, a Holocaust survivor and Russian aggression survivor in Mariupol. All the Jews in Mariupol often used the same narratives, cliché, and their memories. We did not survive a terrible hell to be bombed like that again. Gradually, such memories of the ordeal of the battle for the city in the spring of 2022 were overgrown with mythical details and mysticism. In particular, the mentioned Elvira Bortz recounted how they read the Torah during the shelling and the fragments of Russian shells did not harm them. The same group of oral narratives includes the story of Alisa Rostovtseva, who recalled the saving light of Hanukkah candles, which gave her hope for an end to her terrible Thus, we are witnessing the birth of another cycle of the Jewish narrative tradition about the troubles of the Jewish people, analogies of which can be traced back to the Holocaust, the pogroms of the Ukrainian Revolution, the Gaidamak uprising, Khmelnytsky uprising, and so on. Drawing parallels between the two great tragedies of the Mariupol Jewish community, the Holocaust and the Russian aggression of 2022, is only natural, as the analogies were indeed all obvious. Just as in the years of World War II, Mariupol became a center of concentration for Jews from different territories. In 1941, thousands of Jews from right bank Ukraine, which was already suffering from Nazi occupation, moved to the city, and in 2040-2022, Jews from the occupied territories of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast found refuge in the Mariupol. During the Second World War, the Jews of Mariupol managed to save their lives by hiding in the surrounding villages, especially the seaside villages. And during the blockade of Mariupol by Russian troops, these same villages became centers of spontaneous evacuation of local residents, including Jews. Thank you for your attention.